Dear viewers, the following stories are inspired by real events. However, the names of the characters have been changed to protect privacy. Story 1. A knock at the door at night in rural Pennsylvania. In the late winter of 1988, on a remote farm in rural Pennsylvania, David and Sarah were enjoying the quiet after a tiring day of work. The warm fire crackled in the fireplace, dispelling the chill of the winter night. Outside, the wind whistled through the bare trees, creating a mournful sound. David was reading a book in an armchair by the fireplace, while Sarah was knitting in a chair opposite. Around midnight, when both of them were starting to feel sleepy, a knock suddenly sounded on the door, breaking the quiet atmosphere. The knock was gentle, but very clear in the late night. David raised his head, looking at Sarah with surprise. "Who's here at this hour?" Sarah shrugged. "I don't know. Do we have a date?" Neither of them remembered. David put down the book and stood up, heading for the front door. He looked through the peephole, but it was pitch black outside, and there was no one in sight. "No one," David said, his voice a little puzzled. Maybe the wind hit the door. As soon as he finished speaking, the knocking came again, louder and more urgent. "Knock, knock, knock." Sarah stood up too, her expression starting to worry. "Are you sure there's no one out there, David?" David opened the door, looked out again. Still no one, just darkness and the cold whistling of the wind. He stepped out onto the porch, looked around, but saw no sign of the person who had knocked. "That's odd," David muttered, and closed the door. He turned back into the house, his face full of questions. As they both sat down, the knocking sounded again, this time louder and more urgent. "Knock, knock, 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 knock." Sarah jumped, hugging David's arm tightly. "I'm scared, David. Who do you think it is?" David tried to stay calm, but he was starting to feel uneasy. "I don't know, but it's definitely not a normal person." He stood up again, walking towards the door. This time, he didn't open it right away, but pressed his ear to the door and listened. He heard light breathing outside, as if someone was standing very close to the door. "There's someone out there," David whispered, his voice full of caution. "I know there's someone." He gripped the doorknob, preparing to open it, but at that moment, the knocking sounded again, this time not a gentle knock, but a loud and fierce banging, as if someone was trying to break the door down. Bang, bang, bang. Sarah screamed in horror. Stepping back, David was startled too, and he quickly backed away. The door shook violently under the loud banging. "We have to call the police," Sarah shouted, her voice filled with fear. David rushed to the phone on the table, but when he picked up the receiver, he was horrified to find that the line had been cut. "No signal," David said, his voice filled with despair. "The phone line is cut." The banging continued, getting louder and more intense. Both of them knew that they were trapped in this house, and that some terrifying force was trying to break in. Fear gripped both David and Sarah, not knowing what horrors awaited them beyond the door. In the dim light of the house, David and Sarah stared at each other in horror. The pounding continued, each blow tearing the fragile wooden door apart. Sarah held David tightly, her whole body shaking uncontrollably. "What are we going to do, David? We can't just stand here," Sarah sobbed, her voice choked with fear. David tried to stay calm, even though he was panicking inside. "We have to find a way out. There must be a back door or window that isn't locked." He took Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the back door of the house. They crept down the dark hallway, listening for any sounds. The pounding on the front door was still echoing, but it didn't seem as intense as before. When they reached the back door, David carefully unlocked it and peeked out. Darkness enveloped the back garden. Only the faint moonlight illuminating the bare trees. He saw no sign of anyone or anything. "There's no one here," David whispered, but his voice was still wary. "Let's try going outside." They stepped out of the house softly. Following the dark wall, the cold wind blew in their faces. They circled the house, trying to find somewhere to hide or escape. But every window was locked, and there was no other way out. When they returned to the front of the house, the pounding began again, this time more intense than before. Boom, boom, boom. The wooden door shook violently. Flakes of peeling paint falling to the floor. "It's still there," Sarah moaned, hugging David tightly. "We can't get out." Suddenly, the pounding stopped. They both held their breaths, listening intently. In that terrifying moment of silence, they heard another sound, a gentle scratching on the wall next to the living room window. Scratch, scratch, scratch? David and Sarah looked at each other in horror. They knew that the thing outside didn't just want to get in. It wanted to surround them. The scratching on the wall became clearer and more terrifying. It moved along the wall, then up to the roof. They heard the sharp claws scratching the wooden panels, making a sickening sound. "We have to go upstairs," David whispered, pulling Sarah toward the stairs. "Maybe we'll be safer up there." They crept up the creaking wooden stairs. When they reached the second floor, they slammed the bedroom door shut and bolted it. They leaned back against the door, panting and listening. The scratching on the roof continued. Then suddenly it stopped. Instead, they heard another sound, a loud thump on the roof, as if someone had jumped down. "It's on the roof," Sarah screamed, her voice almost broken with fear. David rushed to the window, parting the curtains and peering out. To his horror, he saw a strange shadow moving across the roof. The shadow was humanoid in shape, but much taller and more monstrous, with long limbs and sharp claws. It was crawling across the roof, heading toward their bedroom window. "We're not safe here anymore," David said, his voice shaking. "We have to find a way to get to the basement." They rushed out of the bedroom and down the dark hallway toward the stairs leading to the basement. But as they descended a few steps, they heard the sound of the bedroom door being slammed from inside. Bang, bang, bang. They both stopped, looking at each other in horror. Something had entered the house, and it was right behind them. They were trapped, with no way to escape. Absolute fear gripped David and Sarah, knowing that tonight would be the most terrifying night of their lives. David and Sarah stood frozen on the stairs, the sound of the banging on the bedroom door still echoing above. They knew there was no time to think. The basement was probably the only safe haven left. They rushed down the dark stairs, their footsteps echoing in the damp, cold space. When they reached the basement, David quickly slammed the heavy wooden door shut and locked it. The room was dark, with only a faint light coming through the small window high up. The smell of damp and cold earth filled Sarah's nose, making her shiver. "Will we be safe here?" Sarah whispered, her voice still trembling with fear. David held her tightly, trying to reassure her. "I hope so. This basement is quite solid. It won't be easy to get into." They sat in silence in the dark, listening for any sounds. The pounding upstairs seemed to have stopped, but instead, they heard a soft scratching on the ceiling above them. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound made them feel like something was crawling right above their heads. Then, the scratching stopped, and there was a loud thud, as if someone had jumped onto the floor right above them. David and Sarah clasped their hands together, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew that something had gotten inside the house. Suddenly, the basement door shook violently under the heavy pounding from outside. Boom, boom, boom. The pounding was so loud and violent that pieces of plaster fell from the ceiling. "It's here," Sarah screamed, tears streaming down her cheeks. David looked around frantically, hoping to find some weapon to defend himself. He found an old crowbar leaning against the wall. While it wasn't an ideal weapon, it would at least help them fight back if necessary. The pounding grew louder, and the wooden door began to shake violently. David and Sarah backed away to the corner of the room, staring at the door in horror. Suddenly, the door swung open with a loud crack, revealing a strange black figure standing right in front of them. The figure was tall and thin, with long limbs and sharp claws. Its face was hidden in the darkness, but they could feel a cold, terrifying gaze piercing their very souls. A horrible hiss came from the figure's throat. It took a step into the room, and in the faint light coming through the window, David and Sarah were horrified to see that it wasn't a human. Its skin was deathly pale, its eyes were red as embers, and its mouth was wide open, revealing sharp fangs. "You woke me." Its voice was hoarse and cold, like the howling of the wind on a winter night. "Now you will pay." It charged at David and Sarah with terrifying speed. David quickly raised the crowbar to defend himself, but the creature was too fast and too strong. It easily knocked the crowbar out of his hand and grabbed his neck with icy fingers. David struggled and gasped for air, but the creature's strength was too great. He felt his breath hitch, and everything began to blur before his eyes. Sarah screamed in pain, lunging at the creature, trying to pull it away from David, but it easily knocked her aside. Sarah fell to the floor, hitting her head against the wall and losing consciousness. The creature returned to David, tightening its grip on his neck even more. David felt the life slowly slipping away from him. In the last moment, he saw the creature's terrifying face leaning over him, and he heard a cold whisper, "This is your last knock." Then everything fell into eternal darkness. The next morning, the police found the house deserted. The front door was broken open, and inside, they found the bodies of David and Sarah in the basement. Their faces were pale with fear, and David had terrible bruises on his neck. No one could explain what happened that night, but the locals were not surprised. They had heard many stories about this haunted house, about knocks at the door in the middle of the night, and about an evil force lurking inside. They believed that David and Sarah have become the next victims of that terrifying curse. Since then, the house has remained abandoned, and it is said that on quiet nights, a gentle knocking can still be heard from inside, a terrifying reminder of what happened, and of the souls trapped forever in the darkness of the remote Pennsylvania farmhouse. Story 2. A new home in the quiet suburb of Westfield, New Jersey. In October 2014, Tom and Susan's family and their 8-year-old daughter Emily moved into a new home in the quiet suburb of Westfield, New Jersey. They were delighted to finally have more space for Emily to play. The 2-story house with a lush green garden behind it quickly became their new home. One Saturday night, when the whole family was fast asleep, Tom was suddenly awakened by a gentle but firm knock on the door. He rubbed his eyes and looked at the bedside clock. The hands pointed to midnight. He gently shook Susan awake. "Did you hear something?" Tom whispered. Susan opened her eyes sleepily. "Did you hear something? Knocking. It sounds like someone is knocking." They both listened in silence. A few seconds later, the knocking sounded again, this time more clearly. "Knock, knock." Tom frowned. "Who's here at this hour?" Do I have an appointment? Susan shook her head. I don't remember. Go and see. Tom got out of bed and walked to the bedroom door and listened. The knocking came again, steady and gentle. He crept down the stairs to the front door and looked through the peephole. It was pitch black outside, and there was no one in sight. There's no one, Tom called, his voice a little puzzled. The wind must have hit the door. He opened the door and looked out again. Still no one. Just the wind blowing softly through the trees and the yellow light of the street lamps on the empty sidewalk. He closed the door and went back into the bedroom. I don't see anyone, Tom said to Susan. You must have heard wrong. But Susan still felt uneasy. I definitely heard the knock. It was loud and clear. That night, Tom and Susan had trouble sleeping. They tossed and turned, listening, but no further knocking came. The following nights, the strange phenomenon continued. At exactly 12 midnight, they heard the knocking again. Still regular and gentle. Tom opened the door several times, but never found anyone outside. He checked around the house, but found no trace of the stranger. Emily, their little girl, also began to hear the knocking. She often woke up screaming in fear. Daddy, there's someone knocking on my door, Emily said with tears in her eyes. Tom and Susan were extremely worried. They couldn't explain what was happening. At first, they thought it was a prank, but the knocking always happened at midnight and no one was outside. They tried installing a security camera in front of their house, hoping to catch the person knocking. But when they reviewed the footage the next morning, they found no one at the door at that time. This continued for several weeks, leaving Tom's family stressed and exhausted. They couldn't sleep well, always worried and scared every night. The knocking at the door in the middle of the night became a terrifying obsession in their new home. They began to suspect that perhaps this house was not as peaceful as they thought. Perhaps there was some supernatural force trying to contact them, and they had no idea what it was for. The inability to find an explanation for the knocking at the door in the middle of the night began to wear on Tom and Susan's spirits. They became irritable and easily angered with each other. Emily grew more and more frightened, waking up often in the night sobbing, calling her parents to come into her room. I'm so scared, Daddy, Emily sniffled, hugging Tom's neck tightly. Someone keeps knocking on my door. Tom tried to reassure his daughter, but he was also worried. He checked every corner of the house, even the basement and the roof, but found no sign of forced entry. Susan also asked the neighbors, but no one heard any knocking at night. One night, when the knocking came again at exactly 12 o'clock, Tom decided to stay up all night to keep watch. He sat quietly in the living room, his eyes never leaving the front door. Susan and Emily slept together in the bedroom, the door slightly open so that Tom could hear if anything happened. Time passed slowly in tension. Exactly at 12 o'clock, the knocking sounded again, still regular and gentle. Tom immediately turned on the light and rushed to the door. But still no one. He looked out, sweeping the flashlight around the garden. But all was quiet and deserted. As Tom returned to the house, he heard Susan calling softly from upstairs. He rushed upstairs and found Susan holding Emily tightly, both of them trembling. What's going on? Tom asked worriedly. Susan pointed toward the dark hallway. I just heard whispering. Very faint, but I definitely heard it. Tom listened, but heard nothing. He assumed Susan was just nervous, but her frightened expression made him worry. The following nights, the strange phenomena began to increase. Along with the midnight knocks, they heard whispering more and more clearly, as if someone was talking very close but couldn't understand. Sometimes, They heard light footsteps upstairs when everyone was downstairs. Emily began to see dark figures moving through the hallways and corners of rooms. The little girl often told her parents about her invisible friend, who always played hide and seek with her at night. "Is that friend cold, Daddy?" Emily asked once, looking at Tom with innocent eyes. "Why is his hand so cold when I touch it?" Tom and Susan looked at each other with concern. They knew that this was no longer a joke or a fantasy. Their house was haunted. One night, when the usual knocking on the door rang out, Tom decided to try talking to the thing knocking. He stood right in front of the door and shouted, "Who's there? What do you want?" There was no answer. Only the knocking continued, steady and incessant. Tom patiently repeated the question over and over again, but still received no response. He felt helpless and afraid. They were facing something they couldn't understand, and they had absolutely no way to fight it. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. The Toms held their breath and listened. In that terrifying silence, they heard a cold whisper just outside the door. "Let me in." The voice was small but piercing, sending a chill down Tom, Susan, and Emily's spines. They knew that whatever was outside didn't just want to knock. It wanted to come in, and they didn't know what terrible things would happen if they opened that door. After the cold whispering from outside the door, both Tom and Susan turned pale. They hurriedly pushed the large sofa across the door, trying to create a thin layer of protection. Emily cried out, hugging her mother's legs tightly. "Daddy, I'm scared," she sobbed. "It's okay, honey." Susan hugged Emily tightly, trying to reassure her daughter. But her voice was also shaking. "Daddy will protect us." Tom rushed into the kitchen, grabbing the largest kitchen knife he had. Although he knew it wouldn't be much use against something invisible, it at least gave him a sense of security. They sat silently in the dark, listening to every sound. The whispering outside had stopped, but the tension in the air still enveloped the whole house. Suddenly, the knocking on the door rang out again, this time no longer gentle, but stronger and more violent. Boom, boom, boom. The door shook violently. The pictures hanging on the wall fell and shattered. "It's trying to break in," Tom shouted, his voice filled with anxiety. Together they pushed the sofa against the door, trying to hold it tight, but the force from outside seemed to exceed their imagination. The door creaked. Cracks began to appear on the wooden surface. In her despair, Susan suddenly remembered something. "Tom, I remember the neighbor told me about strange things that happened to this house before. She said that a family used to live here and something terrible happened." Tom gritted his teeth. "We don't have time to listen to that now. We have to find a way out of here." But before they could act, the living room door was thrown open with a loud crack. A tall and strange black figure appeared right in front of them. Its form was blurry and twisted, as if made of pure darkness. A horrible screech rang out from the shadow. It raised its long, sharp claws towards Emily, who was hiding behind her mother. "No!" Tom screamed, rushing forward, trying to shield his daughter. The shadow swung its arms, throwing Tom aside like a doll. He fell to the floor, hitting his head on the edge of the table and losing consciousness. Susan hugged Emily tightly, retreating to the corner of the room. The shadow slowly approached them, its red Zlovsa eyes fixed on Emily. "She is mine," a hoarse and cold voice rang out from the shadow. "I have waited for this day for a long time." Susan hugged Emily tightly, closed her eyes and prayed. She felt a cold hand touch her daughter's hair. But then, something unexpected happened. Emily, who had been silent in fear, suddenly began to sing. It was a lullaby that her grandmother used to sing to her when she was little. Emily's clear and innocent voice echoed in the dark room. As Emily sang, the shadow seemed to stop. Its red eyes softened, and its shape began to fade. The creepy screech also disappeared, replaced by a soft sigh. Then, the shadow disappeared completely, leaving a terrifyingly silent room. Tom slowly woke up, his head aching violently. He saw Susan hugging Emily tightly, both mother and daughter crying. "What happened?" Tom asked, his voice still weak. Susan hugged her husband tightly, tears still streaming down her cheeks. "I don't know, but I think it's gone." From that night on, the midnight knocking never sounded again. Tom's family still lives in that house, but they never forget the night of terror they experienced. They never know what it was that haunted them, or why Emily's singing could make it disappear. But they do know that they faced something terrifying, and they were lucky to survive. The story of the midnight knock at Westfield is still told by locals to this day, as a warning about the unsolved mysteries that still exist all around us. Story 3. A soldier's knock at midnight in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. In the late fall of 2008, Mark and Jessica, a young couple, moved into a historic house near Seminary Ridge in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. They were both history buffs and were excited to live in a place steeped in stories from the American Civil War. Their house was over 100 years old, with thick stone walls and ancient oak trees surrounding it, creating a quiet and ancient beauty. On a Tuesday night, when both of them were fast asleep, Mark was suddenly awakened by a gentle but persistent knock on the door. He rubbed his eyes and looked at the digital clock on the nightstand, which showed exactly 12 a.m. He gently shook Jessica, who was sleeping soundly beside him. "Jess, do you hear something?" Mark whispered, his voice a little confusing. Jessica stirred slightly, opening her eyes sleepily. "What did you hear?" "Knocking. It sounded like someone was knocking downstairs." They both listened in silence. A few seconds later, the knocking came again, still soft and steady, as if someone was timidly tapping. "Knock, knock, knock." Mark frowned. "Who would come at this hour? We didn't make an appointment." Jessica rubbed her eyes, her voice sleepy. "It must be the wind. It blows hard here at night." Mark wasn't sure. The knocking sounded too clear and rhythmic. Not like the wind. He gently got out of bed, walked to the bedroom door, and listened. The knocking continued, steady as a ticking clock. He tiptoed down the stairs to the front door and looked through the peephole. It was pitch black outside, with only the faint moonlight illuminating the deserted street. He saw no one. "No one." Mark called back, his voice tinged with doubt. "That's weird." He opened the door and looked outside again. Still no one. He stepped out onto the porch, looked around, but saw no sign of the person who had knocked. The coldness of the night enveloped him. "I don't see anyone," Mark said to Jessica as he walked back into the bedroom. "Are you sure you heard right?" Jessica was more alert. "I'm sure, Mark. I heard it clearly. It was very light, but it kept repeating." That night, both Mark and Jessica had trouble sleeping. They tossed and turned, listening, but the knocking stopped. The following nights, this strange phenomenon continued. At exactly 12 midnight, they heard the knocking again, still soft and regular. Mark had opened the door many times, but never found anyone. He even stayed up all night to guard. But the knocking only appeared at exactly midnight and then disappeared again. One night, when the knocking sounded, Mark decided to try to speak up. He stood right in front of the door and said loudly, "Is anyone there? Do you need any help?" There was a long silence. Then, A weak and hoarse voice rang out from behind the door. "Excuse me, please. I'm hungry." Mark and Jessica looked at each other in horror. They couldn't believe what they had just heard. The voice sounded so sad and desperate, as if it belonged to someone who had suffered a lot. And the scariest thing was, they didn't see anyone outside the door. After hearing that weak voice, Mark and Jessica stood still, looking at each other in horror. Curiosity and fear tore at their hearts. Did you hear that?" Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. Mark nodded, his throat tightening. Yes. Who do you think it was?" "I don't know, but it sounds like a soldier," Jessica said, her eyes filled with worry as she looked towards the door. Both of them listened in silence. But there was no more sound. There was only the slight whistling of the wind outside the window. Should we open the door?" Jessica asked timidly. Mark hesitated. "I'm not sure. We don't know what it is. It could be dangerous." But the faint voice kept echoing in their heads. "Please, I'm hungry." A strange feeling of pity welled up inside Mark. Despite his fear, he still felt a responsibility to help the person in distress. Maybe it's just some vagrant in need of help, Mark said, trying to reassure Jessica and himself. "We can look through the peephole first." He carefully approached the door and peered through the peephole. Still no one, but this time, he felt a cold draft coming from the crack in the door. Even though the weather outside wasn't that cold, "I still don't see anyone," Mark said, his voice a little doubtful. "But you're right, that voice sounds miserable." Jessica grabbed Mark's hand. "I'm scared, brother. But what if there really is someone in need?" Finally, Mark decided to take the risk. He gently unlocked the door and opened it a crack. "Is anyone there?" he asked, his voice trying to sound calm. An eerie silence filled the room. Then, the faint voice spoke again, this time clearer and closer. "Please, just some food. I'm so hungry." Mark looked outside, but still saw no one. He could only see darkness and the bare trees in the garden. But that voice, it sounded like it was coming from right in front of the door. "Where are you?" Mark asked, his voice starting to shake. "Here, right in front of the door," the voice replied, sounding like a sigh. Jessica shakily walked to Mark's side, looking out the crack of the door. Suddenly, she saw a faint shadow appear right in front of the steps. It was the shape of a man, wearing an old and tattered military uniform. His face was pale and haggard, his sunken eyes looking at them with a pleading expression. "Oh my God," Jessica whispered. She stepped back in fear. Mark also stared at the shadowy figure in horror. He recognized the uniform as that of a soldier from the Civil War. He was a ghost. How can we help you?" Mark asked, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "Food," the ghost whispered, his voice weak as if about to disappear. I haven't eaten anything for a long time." A feeling of pity welled up in Mark and Jessica's hearts. Despite their fear, they still felt sorry for this poor soul. We'll bring you some food," Jessica said, her voice softer. "Please wait a moment." She hurried into the kitchen, searching for something edible. Mark remained standing at the door, staring at the ghost standing motionless on the steps. He felt a pang of sadness, thinking about the suffering this soldier had gone through. Jessica brought out a loaf of bread and a glass of milk. She placed them carefully on the steps, trying not to touch the ghost. Here's some food for you," Jessica said, her voice still shaking slightly. "Please take this." The ghost said nothing, just slowly bent down and picked up the bread. As his shadowy hand touched the bread, it seemed to dissolve a little. He brought the bread to his mouth and took a small bite. Mark and Jessica stood there, silently watching. They felt a strange mixture of fear and pity. They had just witnessed something completely supernatural, and it had completely changed the way they perceived the world around them. Every night, at exactly 12 o'clock at night, a gentle knock came on the door. Mark and Jessica had grown accustomed to this uninvited guest. They always prepared some simple food, usually bread, fruit or a bowl of hot soup, and placed it on the front step. They never saw the soldier's face clearly, just a shadowy figure in the darkness. But they sensed his gratitude and his deep sadness. After a few nights, when his fear had somewhat subsided, Mark decided to try talking to the soldier. "Who are you? Can you tell us about yourself?" he asked, his voice soft and respectful. There was a long silence. Then, a familiar, hoarse voice rang out. "I'm William. Pennsylvania Infantry. We fought here. Gettysburg. You died in battle?" Jessica asked timidly. "Yes," the sad voice replied. "I was badly wounded and died nearby." Over the following nights, William gradually told Mark and Jessica about his life, about his fallen comrades, about the horrors of war, and about the hunger that tormented him even after he died. He said he still felt hungry, a gnawing and persistent hunger, as if his soul was still bound by the physical needs of life. Mark and Jessica felt great sympathy for William. They understood that he was not a terrifying spirit that wanted to harm them. He was just a lost young soldier, still haunted by the pain and loss of war. They continued to bring William food every night. Sometimes, they even left a small letter, asking about him and expressing sympathy. William also responded with weak whispers, telling of the happy and sad memories of his life. However, William's presence also brought other strange phenomena to the house. Sometimes, they heard light footsteps upstairs when no one was there. Doors opened and closed automatically, and small objects in the house were occasionally moved mysteriously. One night, Jessica woke up and saw a blurry figure standing at the end of her bed. It was William, but this time he was clearer. His face was still pale and haggard, but his eyes shone with a deep sadness. He looked at Jessica for a while and then slowly disappeared into thin air. Jessica told Mark about this, and both of them felt a strange connection with William. They wanted to help him find peace, so that he could move on and no longer suffer from hunger and thirst. They began to learn about the history of the Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment at the Battle of Gettysburg. They went to the local library, reading books and looking at historical documents. Finally, they found information about William, a young soldier who had died in a fierce battle near Seminary Ridge. Mark and Jessica decided to visit the Gettysburg Cemetery and find William's grave. They wanted to lay a flower on his grave and pray for his soul to rest in peace. Early one morning, they drove to the cemetery. Thousands of white graves lined up on the green hills. They walked along the rows of graves, carefully reading each inscription on the stone. Finally, they found William's grave, a simple stone engraved with his name and the date he died. Mark and Jessica placed a bunch of wildflowers on William's grave and stood there praying for a while. They prayed for his soul to be released, to no longer suffer from hunger and the hauntings of war. When they returned home, they no longer heard the midnight knocking on the door. The house was quiet again. They did not know whether William had truly found peace, but they felt a strange serenity in their hearts. They would never forget the uninvited visitor who came every night, the hungry soldier who reminded them of the loss and suffering of war, and of the compassion that humans can have for each other. even in the midst of life and death. If you find this story meaningful, please click the like button and subscribe to the channel to follow other stories of karma and retribution.